right, so you want to talk about God, huh? Big topic for a deep dive, but hey, we're up for it.
Yeah, it's one of those questions that's been rattling around for, well, pretty much as long as humans have been around.
And judging by this stack of articles you've given us, the arguments are as diverse as ever.
Definitely. Both sides, armed with their own sets of reasons. But isn't that what makes this so fascinating?
100%. But let's be clear, folks. We're not here to tell you what to believe. We're just going to lay out the most compelling points from both sides so you can kind of, well, decide for yourself.
Think of it like we're giving you a map of the arguments, not telling you which path to take.
Exactly. So let's kick things off with some of the arguments for the existence of a higher power. The cosmological argument, for example, is a pretty mind-bending one.
Right. It basically grapples with the idea that something can't come from nothing. Like the universe exists, right? So something had to get the ball rolling, so to speak.
And that something, according to this argument, has to be something eternal, something outside our normal understanding of physics.
Like that first domino that sets off the whole chain reaction.
Yeah.
But whether that first push was a who instead of a what, well, that's a whole other debate.
Okay, so the cosmological argument, while super interesting, doesn't hand us a god on a silver platter. But it definitely makes you think about what else could be out there.
For sure. And then we've got the teleological argument. Ever heard of that one? It's sometimes called the watchmaker analogy. Imagine you're strolling along a beach and stumble across a watch.
Intricate little thing, all the gears and springs working perfectly. You wouldn't assume it just, like, plopped into existence randomly, right?
Right, you'd naturally think someone made this, someone designed this for a specific purpose.
And that's basically the logic applied to the universe itself. The laws of physics, the conditions for life on Earth, it all seems so, I don't know, fine-tuned. Like someone designed it that way.
Makes you wonder. But then again, you've got the counter argument, which basically says, well, what if that watch we call the universe wasn't designed in one go? What if it was assembled piece by piece over billions of years through processes like, say, evolution?
So instead of a divine watchmaker, it's more like a cosmic game of chance that just happened to result in, well, us.
It might not be as elegant an explanation, but it's definitely worth considering. Makes you question how much of what we see as purpose is actually just the result of, well, random chance.
Big questions right there. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the moral argument. This one's a real head-scratcher, too. It basically asks if ideas like good and bad can really exist without some kind of higher moral authority.
Right, like if there's no God to define right and wrong, are we just making it up as we go along? Do our morals become completely subjective? Changes depending on the person or the situation, you know?
It makes you think about how we build societies, make laws, even just decide how to treat each other day to day. If there's no ultimate right or wrong, are we just making it all up as we go?
Tricky stuff. And then there's the ontological argument. Now, this one always makes my brain do backflips.
Oh yeah, this is where things get really philosophical. Basically, it argues that because we can even conceive of a perfect being, a god, that variability to imagine it means it must exist somewhere.
It hinges on the idea that existence is a necessary part of being perfect. Like, if you could think of something more perfect than a God that actually exists, well, then the God you're imagining isn't really perfect, is it? At least according to this argument.
Okay, so that one requires some serious mental gymnastics. But hey, that's part of the fun of this whole thing, right? And of course, we can't forget about the role of personal experiences in this whole shebang. You know, people who have felt a powerful spiritual presence, witnessed what they believe to be a miracle, or received what they feel is a direct answer to prayer.
Absolutely. These experiences can be incredibly powerful and often form the bedrock of a person's faith.
Right, but on the flip side, they're also really hard to prove scientifically. What one person interprets as divine intervention, someone else might see as just, well, a coincidence.
It goes back to that subjective element we talked about. Makes this whole debate so enduring, I think. It's a mix of personal experience, philosophy, even a bit of science thrown in for good measure.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So we've just scratched the surface of the arguments for God's existence. But, like any good debate, there's always the other side of the coin to consider.
Right, and flipping that coin over sometimes forces us to confront some pretty tough questions about, well, the world and everything in it, like the whole problem of evil, for example.
Ah, yes, that old chestnut. If God is supposedly all good and all powerful, how do you explain all the suffering in the world?
Exactly. It's a real head scratcher. I mean, we see it every day, right? Natural disasters, diseases, people just being plain cruel to each other. Hard to square that with a loving, all-powerful deity.
It's a question that's haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries.
Yeah.
Where does free will fit in? Does God intervene, but we just don't recognize it? It gets complicated.
Definitely. And it's one of the main reasons some folks turn towards, well, alternative explanations for how the universe works, ones that don't necessarily need a god in the equation.
Like science, the Big Bang, evolution, all that jazz.
Exactly. Science gives us this really compelling narrative of how things came to be step by step without needing I don't know, a divine architect to set it all up.
Which is pretty mind-blowing in itself when you think about it. But does science negate the need for God entirely? That's the million-dollar question.
Right. And this is where things get even more interesting because even if science explains that how the universe began or how life evolved, it doesn't always explain the why.
Good point. It's like, we know how a car engine works, but does that mean there wasn't an engineer who designed it in the first place?
Perfect analogy. Science might tell us how the universe came to be, but it doesn't necessarily answer questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? Or what was there before the Big Bang?
So we're left with this kind of, I don't know, fascinating tension between scientific explanations and those deeper existential questions that science might not have the tools to answer, right?
Right. And then there's the whole issue of evidence, or rather the lack of it, at least when it comes to proving God empirically. We live in a world that values tangible proof, right? But how do you measure faith or quantify a spiritual experience? It's not like putting God under a microscope.
It's like trying to convince a skeptic about ghosts. Just because you haven't seen one doesn't mean they don't exist, right? At least that's what ghost hunters tell me. But try telling that to a scientist who wants hard data.
Exactly. And this is where the God debate gets tricky. What constitutes evidence can be pretty subjective.
Okay, so we've got the problem of evil, the challenges of scientific proof. What else?
Right.
Oh, right. What about those arguments that kind of poke holes in the idea of God's attributes themselves? You know, like, can God really be all-powerful, A&D, all-loving if there's so much suffering?
Ah, yes, the classic conundrum. It's called the incoherence of God's attributes. Can a being really possess all those perfect qualities, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving simultaneously? Or do those qualities kind of contradict each other when you really think about it?
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Just doesn't quite work. And then you've got the argument from what's it called, non-belief.
Right. That one's interesting. It basically says, if God really wants us to believe in him, why make it so difficult? Why all the mystery and hiddenness?
Like, if God wants fan mail, maybe he should make his address a little easier to find. I don't know. It's a thought. But seriously, it's a perspective that challenges our assumptions about what a God who seeks worship would or should do.
It makes you wonder if the very act of seeking, of wrestling with doubt and uncertainty, is part of what faith is all about.
Wow, we've gone through a whole lot of arguments, both for and against the big guy upstairs. I don't know about you, but my brain's feeling a little full right now.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest. But here's the thing, you don't have to pick a side. Like right here, right now, you don't have to neatly categorize yourself as believer or non-believer.
Exactly. In fact, sometimes the most interesting place to be is right there in the gray area, you know, where the answers aren't so cut and dry.
Absolutely. That's where you get agnosticism, right? It basically says, hey, we might just not be equipped to definitively know if there's a God or not.
Kind of like trying to understand the entire ocean just by looking at the surface.
Yeah.
You know, there's a whole lot more going on down there, but you can't grasp it all at once.
Perfect way to put it. And then you have other perspectives that offer, well, different ways of approaching the whole God question, like deism, for example. Ever heard of that one?
Rings a bell.
Yeah.
It's the whole God is the clockmaker idea, right? He created the universe, set everything in motion, and then stepped back to let it run its course.
Exactly. No micromanaging going on there. And, it's interesting. That perspective was actually pretty popular back in the day. A lot of the founding fathers were into that whole deist thing.
Huh. Makes sense, given the whole separation of church and state thing.
Yeah.
But if deism is too hands-off for you, there's always pantheism. That takes things in a totally different direction.
Right. Pantheism basically says God isn't separate from the universe. It's like God is the universe, or everything in the universe is a part of God.
So like that feeling of awe you get when you're staring at the night sky or listening to a really amazing piece of music, that could be a glimpse of the divine right there.
Exactly. It's about finding the sacred in everything. And then you have process theology, which offers even another way to think about God. This one suggests that God isn't some static, unchanging being. Instead, God is constantly evolving, changing, learning right along with us.
So instead of having all the answers, this God is on a journey of discovery, just like we are. That's kind of a comforting thought, actually.
I think so too. It makes the whole idea of God a little less intimidating, a little more relatable. But look, no matter where you land on this spectrum of belief, the important thing is that we're having this conversation, that we're asking these big, tough questions and trying to make sense of it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And hey, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity even more, don't worry. We'll have links to some awesome books, documentaries, even other podcasts in the show notes.
Lots of different perspectives out there for you to explore. Just remember, when it comes to the big questions, like the existence of God, the journey itself is just as important as the destination, if not more so.
Truth. All right, folks, that's a wrap on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds open and keep asking those big, important questions.